Hi there. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Dental Elite. My name's Phil Kolodinsky. I'm one of the directors at Dental Elite, looking after the practice sales. This webinar is all about, is the right move for you potentially selling to a corporate? So first of all, let's talk about who is a corporate. What do we class as a corporate within the modern world of dentistry, and how dentistry and corporates have evolved over the last, let's say, 5 years? Previously, it was consolidated by one or two of the biggest corporate groups and the well-known names in the market. But over the last 5 years, we've seen a large majority of privately backed, equity-backed groups being formed, and now the market is more segmented. You've got a lot more corporate activity. So we class corporate activity as anybody that owns 50 plus practices that's either private equity backed or debt funded. Okay, so they're running their model on an associate-led basis, and as I said, 50 plus practices, normally either part or fully equity backed. Okay, so it's in terms of overall deals that are sold to the corporates, it's actually pretty surprising, the level of deals that go to corporates. It only makes up 12% of our annual sales are to these corporate groups. Now, if we look back historically, there were more sales to corporates. So what we found is probably over the last 24 months is the corporate sales have declined. Now, that's arguably because of the growth of micro consolidators, but it's also due to a number of the corporates taking a step back from acquisition and focusing on their internal EBITDA. So groups and corporates have two ways of growing. They can grow through acquisition, i.e., buy more sites and benefit from the arbitrage of buying from X, growing and selling, or they can look at their internal stock and look to grow their EBITDA internally, which doesn't cost them anything. Okay, so what we found is over the last probably 12 to 24 months, where the cost of debt for these groups has risen significantly, a large proportion of the groups have chosen to look at their internal stock and maximize their EBITDA. But as I said, for those joining slightly later, 12% of sales within our group are sold, or 12% of practices are sold to the private equity backed or the corporate groups that own 50 plus practices. So what have these corporate groups been buying? If we look at the average purchase from a corporate group, so from that 12%, we've done the averages. Realistically, the average revenue for a site that they're looking to acquire is 1.9 million of turnover. Now, that equates to roughly an average EBITDA of £480,000 and an average sale value, i.e. a purchase price of roughly around 3.4 million. Now, what the data suggests, again, over the last 12 months, is more and more of the corporate types of transactions are bigger transactions within the market. Now, that's really down to one sole reason. Is smaller transactions. So corporates used to pick up practices with, let's say, a value of between 1 and 2 million. Is them types of transactions are now being picked up by micro consolidators within different areas of the country. What I mean by micro consolidators is a private individual that owns up to 5 to 10 sites that are looking to acquire within a regional area. And then medium-sized transactions, which typically would have maybe interested the corporates, they're effectively being priced out of the market, or the micro consolidators are offering better terms to make it more attractive for sellers to sell to them. So in summary, the corporate groups now have been forced to buy bigger practices. Okay, so as I said, average revenue of a corporate transaction at this moment in time is about 1.9 million. So that's enough about what the corporates want. We're here to talk about, is it the right move for you? Okay, so what do you need to consider? Okay, firstly, you could potentially maximize your sale value by selling to a corporate, especially if you're a high revenue turnover business. Now, the reason for that is if we go to the revenue levels of 1.9 million and let's say an EBITDA of 480 grand, is actually your micro consolidator might not want to take on that level of funding and debt within their group. Okay, so you may have been priced out the micro consolidators. So actually a corporate group may be your only option to maximize your sale value. So that's the first thing. Okay. Still being the king or queen of the castle is an expression that a lot of dentists use to me. Okay. So in terms of your business, you may have started the practice as a squat, or you may have owned the business for 10, 20, 30 years in some cases. Okay, so a benefit to selling to a corporate is you're not working for an individual dentist, you're working for a corporate group. You have the option to stay on as the lead clinician, and which is really key to a lot of especially high grossing dentists, you're working with the same team that you've built over a long period of time. Of course, any transaction relies on staff, and any business is only as good as the people it employs. So a misconception is that a corporate group will come in and change all of the associate contracts from 50% to 45%, change all of the staff contracts to reduce staffing. Obviously, the Glazers who bought Manchester United recently, they're in the press a lot for making these cuts to staff further down the chain and not making it to the playing squad. Now, in dental practice terms, is then corporates recognize the team that they're buying and the EBITDA that they're buying focuses around the whole team, including nurses, receptionists, practice managers, and of course the associates. So there will be no changes to associate or contracts to staff. Obviously, 2P is there to protect the employment of staff. Okay, so being the king or queen or staying the king and queen of your castle and leading that team moving forward is a key decision principle. Secondly is earnings post-sale. If you're looking to stay on post-sale and you've been in the business for 10, 15 years, is your patient base, and you could probably earn significantly more by staying on as an associate within your existing practice than potentially moving to another practice. So another way selling to a corporate to maximize sale proceeds and net earnings post-sale is to stay within your existing practice and maximize the long-term associate remuneration that you may benefit from. And again, same patient base to deliver the income that you're doing in the shortest amount of time. Okay, that patient base, what they can deliver. Another key point to consider when thinking of a corporate sale or an independent or a micro consolidator is security. Is the vast majority of corporate transactions, once heads of terms have signed, go through to completion unless there is significant changes in the financial due diligence or something reports something that makes the business untenable for them to proceed. They want to buy you and they have the money to do so. So when a corporate looks to buy, they don't base their valuation or what they're prepared to pay on a bank valuation. So they're not going to the likes of Lloyd's and who's instructing a panel of valuers to come and value the business. The business valuation is put together by hopefully your dental agent, and then we broker the deal and they agree to pay an X times multiple of the profit. Now, as long as that profit is verified throughout financial due diligence, the sale will go through and they'll draw down funds from either their equity pot or their debt funders. Okay, so there's no requirement for a bank valuation. Now, conversely, for the micro consolidators and the independents, any valuation is subject to, or any offer is subject to, normally, principally, bank funding agreeing at that level of consideration. So security from a corporate group. Now, one thing I would mention at this point is corporate groups will look at the financial due diligence right up until completion. So one of the key things that we work with sellers is to work with them on a month-by-month basis to ensure the numbers which we've projected the EBITDA on are sustained throughout the whole sale period. So we get to the end of the sale and effectively maximize that value, and there isn't a renegotiation later down the line because revenue and profits have slipped because we think a sale's going on. Timescale is another key fundamental part of the decision-making process. Is the average corporate transaction over the last 12 months has taken approximately 4 to 5 months. Okay, so corporates simply can do it quicker than an independent or a micro consolidator. And there's a number of reasons for that, but the main one is just circling back to bank funding. They're not waiting for a bank to say yes. Okay, they have the funds available once the financial due diligence and the further due diligence, legal, etc., and property is in a place for them to be comfortable to proceed. It will then complete. They've also got the teams to allow them to complete considerably quicker than probably a micro consolidator or anybody going to. So time is crucial. Obviously, business asset disposal relief is changing and going from 10 to 14% on the 5th of April. It's slightly too late probably now for anybody to sell to benefit from that differential of 40k that you'll be paying past that time if you would benefit from business asset disposal relief. CGT went up straight away from the budget to 24%, and there's no signs that will be increased further. Of course, if they do announce that CGT will be changing as per 2026, 2027, 2028, it might be advantageous to do a quick sale. But as of yet, there's no tax liabilities which are planned, which would make it favourable to sell early at this moment of time. Okay, long-term associate position, corporate groups tend to want you to stay as long as possible. So if you're planning on still being a dentist for the next 5 to 10 years and you simply are selling to reduce responsibility, to maybe pay off debts and focus more time on family, etc., then again, you have that guaranteed focus on being an associate within the business. Being part of a wider organisation and what that can offer, many of the dentists and principals that I've acted for have gone on to do joint ventures with corporate groups in buying other practices, or indeed taken on clinical or leadership roles within the wider group and developed outside of clinical dentistry. So if it's your plan to move away from clinical dentistry but still be involved within the dental sector, potentially a group might be the right way to go, is in terms of maybe being a clinical lead, etc., and moving up in the group in a non-clinical way. The considerations now that really fall onto the back of this, what do you need to consider when potentially selling to a group? One of the key decision makers, I think, is your type of practice and the type of corporate group that may acquire you, and how that purchase or that acquisition will affect the business and also the staff. So a lot of the newer corporate groups coming through tend to keep the businesses running from a patient perspective exactly the same as they were pre-acquisition. There are still groups that do rebrand the practice, and especially if you're a mixed or a private practice, I think you really do need to consider this fact that if they do rebrand the business, is that business going to have an impact in terms of being able to generate the revenue or the profit required to fully maximize the sale of the business, i.e. to pay up your earn-out period and your deferred consideration, which we will talk about. But certainly I would consider, what does that group do? Do they take over the business and rebrand aesthetically, so somebody walking in knows it's an X practice, i.e. that group, or do they principally keep the business running as it was previously, so from that patient perspective, nothing's changed? Is there a reputational risk to joining that group from an associate and a clinical team and also an employed members of staff team's perspective? Okay, so on a couple of transactions which I've done, and we've approached multiple groups, the principals have said to me, Phil, I know that my associates will leave if I sell to X group. Okay, but I know they'll be comfortable with this group because actually it's got a very favorable reputation within the area. I know X principal that sold, they've kept it exactly the same. Okay, so something to analyze and something maybe to discuss with peers confidentially that may have sold in your area or colleagues is there any reputational damage within a certain group that you may need to consider, i.e. has your associate said, oh, I'd never work for this group. And if it's a collective of them associates, then what you don't want to do is find yourself selling to that corporate group the associates leave, and then it's nearly impossible to hit the deferred, and you're reliant on the day one consideration. Okay, it's very rare that this scenario happens, but it's happened, and it certainly should be something to consider. Can you meet the deferred targets? So have you maxed out your practice? Now, typically, the typical deal structure for a deferred is you receive anywhere between 70 and 80% at this moment of time on completion of that deal value, i.e., if the deal was worth £10 million and you were on a 70-30 deal, you'd receive 7 million on day one, and the 3 million would be deferred over a period of time. And similarly, 80-20 would be 8 million and then 20 deferred. So typically the deal structures are 70% or 30% deferred. So in that scenario, so let's say you're a practice with £1 million revenue and you've got 3 chairs and you're fully maxed out and you can't grow that business anymore than maybe putting your prices up year on year to compensate for inflation. Okay. Are you sure that you can hit them deferred targets, which increase every year by RPI or an agreed percentage, okay, which is compounded? Because you need to think, okay, am I happy that this business will grow? Okay, because your deferred will be linked to it. And the big one within any corporate transaction is if you're a clinical dentist working clinically, is are you happy and willing to stay on? Okay, more than ever now, the corporate groups that are looking to acquire want to acquire with practice owners that want to stay long term. Okay, and simply, if you do have a principal and we approach a corporate and that principal says that they want to leave after a year, then there is a hit on both the multiple and potentially that acquisition will be thrown out by the board, because what the corporate groups want is a principal to take on the joint responsibility for continuing to operate at the same level, of which they've paid a multiple of anywhere between 7 to 8 times the EBITDA of the overall practice. Associate-led practices work slightly differently within the market, but there will still be a deferred consideration applied, and it's all about finding the right partner to partner with. Okay, so principally, if you're wanting to sell or thinking about selling to a group, you need to understand or be open to there being a time period which you're tied into. Now, that time period really relates from a clinical perspective, really relates to your input into the business. Again, just going on the £1 million revenue turnover metric is if you're doing 600k of that revenue, and then your hygienist is also seeing all of your patients, so effectively your patient base is, let's say, 700k, then that business is really hinged upon you. And that would probably equate to maybe a 4 to 5 year tie-in. Whereas if we had the same £1 million practice and you were only doing 300k of the revenue, and the revenue was dispersed between multiple associates, a strong plan, and hygiene, it may be more typical for that deal structure to certainly be on a 3-year deal, if not even a 2, maybe. It all depends on risk. It all depends on area. It all depends on growth potential. So there's a number of factors which play into deferreds and tie-ins, and you need to speak to a dental broker who will be able to advise you accordingly once they've analysed the business and the risk profile of that business from a corporate's perspective. Okay, so is it going to be the right move for a corporate? So will a corporate be interested in you? If we just go back to the first part of the webinar, is corporates are buying bigger EBITDA practices and higher grossing practices. That again, their average turnover practice, which they've acquired, is 1.9 million, and the average EBITDA is around 450 to 500k. So they're being forced to buy bigger because of the micro consolidators buying the 1 million to 2 million value stock and acquiring them and looking to grow them and form a mini group. So principally, there needs to be enough profit for it to work on an EBITDA basis, and the risk of that business needs to be leveraged against multiple associates Okay, they don't want to buy something where the principal is doing 90% of the income. So need EBITDA, and they need a seller that's willing to stay on. They need somebody that's accepting of the deferred, because the seller realizes, or in the case of the practice, actually the day one value from the group is higher than what they would get from an individual or even a micro consolidator. So it makes sense, even though there's a deferred and there's targets, to sell to that corporate group. And of course, is there room to grow? And are you confident that that business can grow to the levels required, which is the revenue that the valuation is based on, plus RPI, or an agreed percentage year on year? And when we look at most sets of accounts for higher grossing practices, in the last 5 years, we have seen year on year growth. And of course, a group will look to grow your business. It's not for their self-interest to not pay deferred. But they want to establish and grow that practice, because their overall benefit of ownership and growth EBITDA, i.e. any EBITDA that they can add through ownership, which they haven't paid for. So taking a practice from 400k EBITDA to 500k, when they sell, if they haven't paid for that 100k of EBITDA and they sell for a 12x multiple, that's at a far greater profit level than simply the arbitrage by buying a practice at, let's say, 7.5 times and selling at 12. So all of these groups want to grow. So it's a misconception that they don't want to pay you the deferred. If a seller's paid 100% of their deferred, then everybody's a winner in that scenario. Okay, and in 90% of cases, probably more, all of the deferred is hit. But it all depends on a number of factors. And the main factor is probably joining a group or selling to a group that has a shared vision with you, and that you believe you will work well together to achieve that growth and partner with. And it should be considered a partnership as opposed to you selling. I always say to principals is, when you approach your team before you complete, because of either 2P requirements or part of the exchange. So once you've exchanged and it's legally binding, and you'll meet your team to discuss the sale. So I always advise principals to say that you're going into a partnership with this group and you are still a shareholder within the business, because effectively you are, if you have a deferred consideration. You've got risk attached. You're working with them as a partnership. So let me just explain how deferred works. So for consideration, there's two types of deferred targeting. It's either a target based on revenue, or it's a target based on EBITDA. Now, most deals principally are based on turnover. The reason why deals are mainly based on turnover is it's a lot easier to manage, and it's a lot easier to report. And also, if there is any discrepancies, it's a lot easier for the accountant to see that income coming through the system. Whereas EBITDA can be slightly more subjective, although there is pro formas which are put into the SPA, i.e. on what income and cost lines are included within the EBITDA calculation. Simply turnover is easier than a profit calculation. Okay, so it's simple as that. And we try and advise vendors to, or push offers to be turnover, with the exception, with one exception, which is where if the business isn't operating as well as it could be, there could be the potential for an EBITDA deal to be slightly better, because obviously groups can benefit from discounts on materials, of labs, of cost of sale, and they may be able to run that business more efficiently. Some groups offer on EBITDA, some offer on turnover. It's about leveraging to get the best possible deal. So as in terms of the deferred elements, so let's do this really simply. You're selling for 2 million and you're on a 70-30 deal, okay, where you're on a 3-year earnout. Okay, so 2 million, 70-30, 600k is going to be deferred, and you're going to get 200k each year for 3 years. Okay, and your turnover is £1 million. So for the first year, the target would be £1 million plus the agreed uplift. Okay, and the uplift is there so you maintain the same level of EBITDA as what they're purchasing with inflation. Of course, if turnover stays the same within any business, the profit is likely to be reduced because, in essence, all of the costs have increased, and if you haven't increased the turnover, it's not going to deliver the same profit, especially in the current economic climate where inflation has been anywhere between 2% and right up to 10%, and of course changes in national insurance for employers, national minimum wage, and of course rising heat, light, and materials. Businesses need to continue. So that growth is there to protect the EBITDA which they've purchased to make sure it still delivers the same. So on the £1 million, let's say you agree a 5% rise, you would need to meet the target of £1 million plus the 5%. Okay, so ease of maths, let's say that's 1.05 million is the target that year, and you only achieve 1.04 million, or the practice achieved 1.04 million in revenue. So you're 10 grand under the deferred. Okay, you've got 200k for that year deferred and on the hook, and you're 10k short of the target. You would still receive £190,000. So the deferred penalty as such is on a pound for pound basis of any lost revenue. Okay, so you don't lose the full 200, you lose a pound for pound basis. Now in years 2 and potentially subsequent years, you will be able to potentially make up that shortfall. So in year 2, if your target, for instance, was 1.1 million and you lost 10 grand the previous year, but you overperformed by 10 grand, you can recoup that loss in the next year. So there's that potential. On EBITDA targets, it works slightly differently because it's based on profit, and they're buying on a multiple of profit, where instead of it being a pound for pound basis, you lose £3 for every £1 of EBITDA, or we look to negotiate that. A lot of corporate groups will start off, if negotiating directly without an agent involved, on a turnover penalty of £2 for every pound, and I've seen it as high as 5 or 6 times for every pound of EBITDA lost. So again, key to have a dental expert involved. A key point to, again, a dental broker is, as I mentioned, 12% of our sales are to corporate groups. So we know where we can leverage offers. We know which terms and which levers we can pull with various groups to get the best possible deal, as in terms of not only purchase price, but deal terms 80-20 if applicable, or even non-targeted deferred. You know, we're very successful in being able to negotiate terms of which maybe not all of that deferred element is linked to revenue, but it may be linked to you staying on for the 3-year period doing the same amount of clinical days. And if you stay on and you're there and you're happy, the end of the 3 years, no matter what that revenue is, you still get that deferred. Now, that's unlikely to be the whole 20 or 30%, but of course, if we can get a level of guaranteed deferred in there, it minimizes the risk on that deferred element. Okay, so our experience with groups, it allows us to maximize the offers. It allows us to understand different types of deal structures and negotiate the right type of deal structure for your unique setup and your unique practice. It allows us, when we're valuing, and I think this is the key point, is when you sell to a micro consolidator or an individual, they'll be basing valuations on current accounts and data. Now, with a corporate group, what we're able to do is do a run rate valuation of where your business is live today and the EBITDA. And because they're not bank funded, as long as we can justify that, they're principally happy to move forward with the sale based on that run rate, which again can exponentially increase the value of your business when we're looking at where the live data is, as opposed to historic data. Comparable data, you know, selling on a monthly basis to corporate groups allows us to see live where the multiple is for that type of practice. So again, you know, if we're agreeing X practice at this multiple, we will then look to leverage a higher multiple, or at least use that as the base multiple for negotiations and of course for our valuation. And one of the key points that we also do is, when we're doing or negotiating the heads of terms and acting on your behalf on the negotiation of the heads of terms, we know various clauses and protections in the deferred elements, and within that heads of terms, that we can get you added protection for that deferred. So that may be ring fencing advertising, so the the corporate group can't drop the advertising spend. It may be ring fencing the annual wage increase that you give all of your staff to make sure you have the best possible team. And we may be able to negotiate that. Of course, they're obligated to keep them transactions going or to keep them commitments. Again, it's all based on each individual practice. So it may not be the case you can negotiate that on every deal. But of course, what we're there to do is to not only negotiate the best possible sale price, but the terms of which you can maximize your sale, advertising, recruitment, staffing. So that's the corporates. Okay, so that's what you've got. All of that you've got to consider, and all of that is what an agent should go through with you when you've got a valuation or you've booked a health check meeting with us and we're valuing your business and you're deciding on how you go to market, what route you go, who's the likely buyer going to be. Are you too big to sell to a micro consolidator or an individual, and is the corporate the only route that you can go down? And then you've got to almost pick the best corporate or the one that you believe and we advise you can maximize obviously the sale value from a net day one value to a post sale values in terms of deferred, and then even ratchet deals for growing that business with the help of the group and getting more purchase price because you've helped them effectively grow that group. So what's the alternative for the mid to larger practices? It really is that micro consolidator market. So although this is titled groups, if you have a value, if your practice is valued anywhere between 1.5 million and let's say 3 million, so you've not got to that next level of 400 to 500k EBITDA yet, is we cannot rule out the micro consolidators. So that's the privately owned individuals that have formed groups of 5 to 10 practices where over the last 5 to 10 years they've paid off a lot of debt, they're in a really strong cash position. Their overall ambitions is to be a micro or to be a mini corporate group or to even sell to one of their corporates after building a portfolio of 10 to 15. And actually, what they'd love to do is there's still growth within your business and they want to grow. And them types of buyers, you may have a deferred, but it may be simply a deferred to allow for the cash flow to repay the loan in year 1 and 2, as opposed to taking on the additional debt at 8.5%. So that income is that deferred element is guaranteed, or indeed there may not be a deferred element. Okay, at this moment of time, deferreds for micro consolidators aren't necessarily linked to the risk of the business because they're assuming the risk as an individual. It's simply because they would rather pay you the deferred out of the profits of the business as opposed to taking on that additional debt at a very high interest rate. So the micro consolidators, I can't stress enough, are serious considerations for anybody looking to sell a practice. And in some instances, still, the independent market is a very strong market depending on the type of practice and the funds available to some individuals, allowing them to still complete on big deals. So still not untypical for individuals to purchase practices and even first-time buyers for 2 to 2.5 million. So the market is there. Every practice is different. Every practice is valued differently. There's a lot of considerations when potentially looking to sell to a corporate, which need to be accounted for and discussed with a dental broker. So my advice to anybody is don't rule out a corporate. Certainly don't rule out a micro consolidator, but speak to a dental broker that will be able to go through where your practice fits in this big practice sales market, who the right type of buyer is, what the deferred will likely be, and which effectively group they would advise you to meet, to discuss, and to see if a deal can be done. Thank you for your time this evening. We will be doing more of these webinars just because of the number of people that have benefited from the webinar. If anybody would want to give me an email or a call to set up a practice valuation or to discuss anything that we've discussed today, my email address is phil@dentalalite.co.uk, and that's 1L. Alternatively, mobile number is 07818 451138. Thank you very much for taking the time this evening. I hope it was informative and look to hear from you soon. And if not, I hope you join one of our webinars in the future. Thanks a lot.